Need a search engine optimization SEO services? Then get in touch with our professional and friendly team to learn more about our range of custom and tailored services designed to suit your exact needs. Every one of our professionals have acquired years of experience, which ensures you get the very best. Our experienced staff is waiting to hear from you and to answer any specific questions that you may have on how we can meet your needs. Just ask for a consultation and let us prove our commitment to you as we promise to maintain the highest level of quality and commitment. Your satisfaction is our prime concern. So please, don't hesitate to get in contact with us and let us show you all the great options we have.
All right, good evening and welcome to another night of Pump Up the Volume. So what we do in Pump Up the Volume is really try to amplify voices of community leaders and organizations, bring to light all of the grassroots efforts that are focused on equity, justice issues, as well as many other issues that community leaders and organizations are fighting for on a daily basis. As we know, here in Rhode Island, we oftentimes confront political corruption, systemic racism, and a number of other issues that create barriers for the voices within community, and those voices often go unheard. So Pump Up the Volume is focused on elevating those voices and, again, amplifying them so that everyone throughout the state of Rhode Island can truly understand what the issues are that communities are facing and what those communities are demanding in terms of solutions to address those issues. So today I have the privilege, as always, of being accompanied by Mr. Bill Bartholomew from the Bartholomew Town podcast. Thank you, Bill, for joining us today. Also, Pat Ford, host of the Coalition Radio and founder of the Coalition Radio Network, where we have the privilege of streaming from this show, Pump Up the Volume. So thank you, Mr. Ford. And also we have the privilege of having Roberto Gonzalez with us back again today. Roberto represents youth throughout the state of Rhode Island, I would say, but also Steambox, and he is himself an educator. And again, seeing that there's so many youth-led events that are happening, protests that are happening today, it's just been an amazing thing to witness. And I would love, and we would love, to really get Roberto's perspective on how those events have gone, how those protests have gone, but also all of the resources and visions that our youth are putting together and synthesizing to create a better future here in Rhode Island and throughout the United States. So thank you again for joining us. On today's call, what I'd like to do is really spend more time facilitating the discussion and kind of pointing it in the direction where it may be needed. But to start, as always, I'd like to invite Bill to give us a rundown of all of the recent news updates, whether it's related to, again, the protest, as well as COVID-19 and anything else that you feel might be important for the listeners to know.
Dr. Munoz, always a pleasure, and nice to see you, Roberto. And Pat Ford, wow, I saw you out there at the rally this, I think it was, what was it, Saturday I saw you out there, or Sunday, I should say.
Yep.
Yeah, we find ourselves, as you mentioned, Doctor, in this really fascinating time. It's certainly the brewings of the ingredients of future history books right here as we see the convergence of the COVID-19 crisis and these social justice, I guess, marching, so to speak, figuratively and literally, that's taking place around the country. And zooming into Rhode Island, that convergence is something that we've been discussing, Doctor, for the better part of the last 3 months, where those who are most impacted by COVID-19 are typically those who have the least access to quality health care and many other factors that, don't necessarily include being victimized by police, etc., but oftentimes overlap. So in the last few days, we obviously on Saturday, we had the March, the second rally in Newport. There was one the previous week as well that drew about, I don't know, a few hundred folks. But then on Sunday, a really powerful rally that began. There were two rallies that converged. One that began at Kennedy Plaza, that being the Gen Z We Want to Live rally, a youth-led really call for immediate social justice remedies, and also the Code Black rally, which began at Rhode Island Hospital and featured members of the medical community, that they converged on the State House. There were several thousand there. I would estimate 2,500 in a rally that was one voice after another, particularly those of the youth. One person was as young as 9 years old. We saw medical doctors get up and speak, Brown University medical students get up and speak, and it was a robust conversation that really called for not only police reform, but for the state as a whole to sort of wake up and pay attention to these pressing issues. Now, the governor on Monday did address these rallies, and more so the concern that some folks have about, you have large groups of people getting together here in the midst of a pandemic and what those consequences are. But there really aren't too many major updates on the COVID-19 front here this week. I think we're going to be looking for the data points next week and the week after to see really what came out of these rallies, if there are, there's a spike in cases, so on and so forth. Now, I know a few people who were at these rallies have been tested and did test negative, so there's some initial anecdotal hope that there's no connection between a spike or potential spike and the rallies that are taking place. But by and large, you feel like things are moving. We saw Attorney General Noronha just yesterday call a last-second press conference in which he detailed several points of order that he was going to bring and he did bring, matter of fact, last night to the General Assembly when it comes to his ability to deal with police misconduct. Today, we had Commissioner Parry announce that there won't be any charges or significant investigation into what has become known as the firefighter saga, in which a Providence firefighter says he was racially profiled by Providence police. So that story sort of stopped in its tracks. It seems like it's a public relations maneuver on the part of Commissioner Parry, more so than a satisfactory resolution. But I think the air right now is that COVID-19 is still here in Rhode Island, but the social justice conversation has overtaken it as the primary driver of the news of the day, and it will continue to be that way probably for at least the duration of the summer.
Yeah, thanks so much for sharing, Bill. So just to before we transition to Roberto, I'd love to get his perspective on the protests and the events that are coming up as well. Now, the body cam was off, right, on the police officers that were engaged with the firefighter. Was that one of the discoveries? Was that?
Yeah, there were two police officers involved in this incident, and not to get into the specifics of the incident, into the weeds too much, basically the Providence police argue that they had received a call of an armed robbery on a red car, and that one red car happened to be occupied by a Providence firefighter who is a person of color and his girlfriend. These Providence police officers came upon this red car, and despite the fact that the firefighter was in uniform, had a radio, and so on and so forth, he was met with guns drawn and described it himself to WPRI television as racial profiling. Now, Commissioner Parry, the big takeaway was that one of the two Providence police officers did not engage his body cam, so he's going to be disciplined just for that technical infraction, which, by the way, that's a major infraction in my mind. What we haven't seen yet, and unfortunately I wasn't in attendance at this press conference today. I was in Newport, as a matter of fact, but we need to know what other vehicles were stopped, what other red cars were stopped with respect to this particular armed robbery. What reaction did the police have in those cases? Who was in those other red cars? We need to understand the full picture. And until we do, we won't really understand whether or not racial profiling did or did not occur.
Yeah, Bill, I'd like to if I could just briefly draw an historical analogy from just a couple of years ago. Bill, I'm not sure if you were back in town at that point, but a white car or a white truck was a witness testified had left the scene of a crime with someone who had allegedly taken weapons out of the back of a state trooper's vehicle that he had escaped from. That ended up in essentially a barrage of weaponry, literally a shooting gallery on I-95 right outside the Providence Place Mall. I believe that was just about 2 years or so ago. I've got a question. I'll throw it out there. I'll say it. Are the Providence Police Department properly trained in situations like that? And is there a significant part of them that are just, quite frankly, for lack of a better term, trigger happy? It's astonishing that these type of confrontations are almost sought after in a crowded city in what is clearly contentious times. I just throw that out there to everyone.
I'm not a friend of I'm not a friend of the police, I would say. I'm not a supporter of the police. There are some people who I love who wear the badge, but I still have this FTP mentality, right? Like there's this, they're an operator of systemic racism and injustices. But I would give some pushback on trigger happy, because the last time I felt like our police were trigger happy was when there was that awful scene on Route 95 by the mall, probably 2 years ago. We're not talking about an instance where somebody was shot, but we are talking about an instance where it does seem like race came into play, and it does seem like that happens very often here and everywhere else.
Interesting.
Yeah, you think back to the Cornell Young Jr. incident. That's something, I think I was in like 7th grade, an off-duty police officer who was a person of color who was gunned down in a friendly fire incident for getting involved in a situation, a criminal situation, when he was off duty. You know, there's definitely a history of, even with the Community Safety Act and so on and so forth, there's obviously a distrust between many community members and the Providence police that is tangible. There's folks like Kobe Dennis who have tried to bridge that. I think Hugh Clements, as chief, has done a better job than his predecessors, for sure, in some areas. And if I'm not mistaken, the incident that you're referring to, Pat, and also Roberto, was more of a state police engagement. It was a multi-municipality operation. The vehicle was stolen off 146. It was a state police cruiser. I think the chase began in Warwick. So, it may not be as fine an illustration of the Providence police as just maybe Rhode Island police as a whole, or police as a whole. But nonetheless, look, until that body cam footage is released and we can understand the full picture of what happened that night that the and I forget his name, unfortunately, the Providence firefighter had guns drawn on him, we won't be able to understand if it was racial profiling. Now, if there were other operators of red vehicles that were pulled over that had guns drawn on them and they turn out to be white people, then you might be able to back off the notion that it was not racial, that it was racial profiling. But I'm hesitant to do so in spite of the commissioner's statements today.
What's interesting about these body cams, and I saw a study, I didn't evaluate the study design to see how large the data set was for them to reach certain conclusions. But what I found interesting, even if it was a small sample, was that there seemed to be a trend with essentially the audio associated with body cams, with how police officers were interacting differently with people of color, being a little more aggressive in terms of the use of certain words as compared to white individuals. And so I think as we get these body cams out there and as everyone's wearing them and we can assess the data, I think we're going to continue to see trends like that. And I do think it is important, especially as we pursue legislation. So speaking of that, I know Senator Metz has re-proposed or presented once again the Police Officer Bill of Rights, I believe it is, Bill. Would you like to kind of discuss where that is, where it historically was, and whether you think we're going to really get anywhere with it?
Look, that comes down to a collective bargaining conversation, really, more than anything else. And Senator Metz on Gene Valicente this morning on WPRO, he sort of just played the middle of the road. He did that nice walk, that tightrope all the way across. You may as well set it up across the Providence Place Mall to the Omni Hotel for him to tap dance across, so to speak. They're trying not to make this into what it really should be, which is a complete undermining and overhaul of the police officers' Bill of Rights. Now, that goes against my personal standpoint that unions are essential and inherently American and so on and so forth. But the pendulum has swung too far into the favor of the police officers, where, for example, an officer who's accused of misconduct is allowed to select one of 3 members of the review panel that will determine his fate, him or herself. So things like that need to be completely reviewed. And frankly, you won't be able to address police misconduct until you're able to address the role that unions play in police departments around the country.
Yeah, and I mean, let's just be clear for our listeners. I mean, systemic racism, you can follow it up the chain of command, right, beyond the agencies themselves, into the unions, into political leadership, state leadership. And so I just want to be clear here that, you know, when we're talking about these issues, you know, we're talking about the police force or law enforcement agencies, you know, it's not disconnected from our local representatives, right? Especially those that are not being vocal, that are not pushing for change. I just want to make it clear, Representative Anastasia Williams is not one of those people. She's out there fighting. So I think it is important to also lift up those that are willing to call out the system. And that's just a fact at this point. And those that are silent, it's important to vote them out. So we should also state that. Okay, so with that
100%.
said, thanks, Bill, for the overview and kind of giving us a rundown of where everything is going. Roberto, would you like to now take us to kind of youth? You know, where are they? How are they going about organizing these things? What is their vision for the future? And how can we support them?
We have mutual friends who are amazing and doing amazing works. We talk about Kia Bryant with Dare. We talk about Shonda Womack with Arise. Everything that I think Kobe was already mentioned, and Ray Watson and so many others. There's a lot of great groups and organizations. So I want to make clear that Steambox, by the way, you can follow us at SteamboxRI. We're having great times. But the reason we're having great times is because we're a bunch of nerds. We do technology and science projects. So it's an interesting and different gauge when I talk to my students versus when I talk to Shonda's students, who they are going right for youth leadership. When I talk to my students, especially in the K through 12, that whole spectrum, there's a huge difference in their perception of community policing, right? And their level of respect or satisfaction with community policing. So my younger students see, you know, Officer Dan come in and he's dressed up nice and he talks about good guys versus bad guys. And it's very respectable for the younger crowd. But what the younger crowd doesn't really have, that I think some of my older students have, is that level of firsthand experience with students, that level of firsthand knowledge from being stopped, you know what I mean? Not necessarily for driving, but just being stopped for walking and being asked a bunch of questions and having things presumed about them because of the way they look. So when we talk about a youth perspective, I want to mention that it's very different depending on age and depending on level of experience and trust with the police, and it's wide. And some police, and we've mentioned before, some of them came in and did some work at Steambox and did some things to earn maybe some of those students' trust, which I have mixed feelings about because I have my own feelings about police. Bill mentioned Cornell Young. He's a friend of the family. Cornell was a friend of mine. So you know, it's no wonder why the past 20 years I've had a huge chip on my shoulder when it comes to police. So the temperature is hot with the students. And what I think I'm afraid of is the weather changing and the news cycle changing. I'm afraid that maybe we're losing sight. While we're juggling one ball, we're taking our eye off the other. And I'm afraid that maybe some of my students are being less precautious with masks and social distancing. And I know a lot of our adults in the community are doing the same thing. And I think some of those things are scary. I know I'm all over the place right now, but so is the world, right? We've got community justice issues. We've got an ongoing pandemic. This week, Representative James Taylor, I don't know if any of you saw this, but he made a social media post talking about the beautiful Columbus statue that we have right outside of Steambox's flagship school, Alvarez High School, right? It's right across the street from that. And he said, hey, you know, we're protecting the statue. It's in a box now. We've got round the clock surveillance on this statue, and we're like paying the police to make sure nothing bad happens to our heroic Columbus statue. And furthermore, like, we will press charges against a person who tagged with graffiti, you know what I mean, the box that encased the statue. And I really feel like, so when we talk about youth perspective, I feel like it's important to point out that not only are there so many things going on at once, which leads to confusion, but I think there's a lot of confusion in general. I think from person to person, if we go from person to person on any one of these subject matters, some people feel like it's fine to go out and go shopping and skip the social distancing. And some people feel like it's fine. It's fine for people to arrest somebody, or the guy at Wendy's, you know what I mean, shouldn't have resisted. And if you go from person to person, we're seeing all of these different results right now. And I feel like the same is mostly true for my students until they join the pool of having experienced it firsthand. So I know I was all over the place. I know I was jumbled. Please forgive me, but I feel like all of this is cooking into one gross stew right now.
Well, yeah. So Pat, go right ahead.
No, Roberto, I was going to ask you, what was your reaction? Because we weren't able to link up last week, when it appeared that the state of Rhode Island was on sort of almost an epiphany, where folks who aren't normally connected to the question of racial inequality and racism were all of a sudden, for the first time, discussing it and gingerly, as it were. And then all of a sudden, the great donut debacle happens. And it was almost as if the entire media in the state of Rhode Island, the conventional media, if you will, had this moment of, whew, that's a relief. There's some outrage porn we can drive down the highway on and report on, and wow, another night not spent in show prep, and we don't have to ask difficult questions or actually reach out beyond our comfort level. Because at the same time, and I'm a little jumbled too, guys, so I'll apologize in advance. At the same time, when the mainstream media was going to what I call all the usual sources for their roundtable discussions on racism in the state, and none of those usual sources included any of the people who were intimately involved in taking this argument, this conversation, this debate to a whole new level. Is there that big of a disconnect?
There's two things. I have two responses to that. One, when it comes to the donut thing, what I found was really interesting is a lot of the apologists, Bill was out there when he was at the police station, and there was that one person who came and kneeled with the crowd, and it felt like pandering. And on Bill's live feed, I said, this is who that person is, and this is their job with the police. Their job with the police is actually to come out and do that and bridge the gap with the community. So while some people are doing that, and while we probably know police officers who are taking this time and a platform to say, hey, it's just a few bad apples, it's not all of us, we're really one of you, it's funny because they really got to show their ass when the donut thing came out. Because when the donut thing came out, they're using their platform to cry about not getting a 15-cent discount for donuts. You know what I'm saying? Like, so which is it? Are you one of us, or are you suddenly, a baby because you can't get your Blue Lives Matter donut discount? Blue Lives Matter, by the way, they're not Smurfs. They're people. They don't have blue lives. Sorry. The other point that I wanted to mention around that, is yes, the news cycles keep going, but it gets really tough. It gets really icky. I want to take this time to point out that around that, the youth are mobilizing again this Friday for a Juneteenth rally. And the Juneteenth rally is about systemic racism. It is about organizations of systemic racism. And even if you say not all police are bad, and if that's the route that you want to take, or just some bad apples kind of, even if you just want to take that route, which I'll argue with you later about, this is to say that organizationally it has a historic element of racism to it, and they're looking for some change. Partially defund the police, and I think you guys know that there's a difference between defund the police and abolish the police. And additionally, I think they want to get into some other things. Defund the police, talking about redistributing some of that money, right? So that some of that money goes into some social programs so that people can have a different response for nonviolent crimes. Juneteenth, a youth-led rally happening this Friday. It starts at Classical High School, and it'll be moving all the way to the State House.
So, Roberto, for someone who doesn't know about Juneteenth, can you describe the historical significance?
Juneteenth is the date captured, the date celebrated for the end of slavery, for the abolishing of slavery. They use June 19th, which is Juneteenth. It is a Black celebrated holiday that up until recently, a lot of people weren't even very familiar with, but we're very familiar with Columbus Day.
Right. So you bring this all together from a youth perspective, right? So you have Juneteenth coming up. You also have this historical, this history of the initial police forces being slave patrols, right, to chase down slaves. You also have this history of Columbus. And so all of these things are intersecting around a single point, which is the people of color were chased down, captured, enslaved, tortured, and killed. And so, just to put it in perspective, the youth they're learning this in school. They're learning these different stories. Many of them have had some type of exposure to police brutality, whether it's family members or friends that have had encounters. And, of course, COVID-19 has also kind of dealt them a better understanding of systemic racism. And so you have all this new information, probably depending on their age, as you mentioned, Roberto, really just being thrown upon them. And, in terms of their reaction to that information, right, their reaction to acknowledging the systemic racism is still alive, and that the history that their ancestors experienced 400 years ago hasn't necessarily changed altogether. The approach has simply changed. How do you feel that they've responded to all of that?
Can we add context to three things? When you talk about policing and its roots in slavery, like the origin of policing is to chase down slaves, right? Like the badge is the same in everything. When we talk about Columbus and the effect that it's had on our people, like the people from the Caribbean, our people, Dr. Munoz and I, we're the descendants of Taino natives, right? They're native to the land, right? And I don't know how direct, right? If you do your DNA thing, like how much of it was the Africans that were brought in, how much of it was Columbus's people that were brought in and really overtook and overpowered our people, right? Like, I don't know how much the mix is for Dr. Munoz and I, but we're both fair-skinned, probably a lot of Spaniard in there. But that's the effect of Columbus coming in and erasing our history and implementing their own. And that statue, a testament to that monster to our people, a testament to the monster to our people, exists and stands not only in our community, but across the street from the school that Steenbach spends the most time in. It's right there. Our students pass by it as if that monster to our people is some sort of hero. That's a thing. So I just wanted to stop.
And let's put, yeah. Well, and let's put this in perspective. Oh yeah, no, absolutely. So I just want to put this in perspective for our listeners who may confuse this with our saying that Italian heritage is not beautiful. Italian heritage is beautiful. I mean, I studied in Italy. I didn't see a single statue of Christopher Columbus when I lived in Firenze in Florence. I didn't see a single statue. I saw statues of San Lorenzo, a man who died burned as a martyr for his people. I saw those types of statues, but I didn't see one of Christopher Columbus. So I think it is important for us to acknowledge that Italian heritage is beautiful, and even they do not lift up a serial killer.
And it's BS history to begin with, right? It's super friendly, and it's revisionist history. And I think another example, the most friendly, when we talk about this is what they're learning in schools, I mean, it's not, though. What they're learning, they're not learning Juneteenth, right? They're not learning Juneteenth in the books. What they're learning is they're learning the most docile, friendly portrait of MLK. And the reason that they are, and I don't want to take away anything from one of our heroes, right? Like, I'm not doing that. But what I'm saying is, the reason that they use MLK on that platform, and the reason that MLK is okay to go into these history books, is because he's the most digestible to their history, to white history, to be able to explain it to our people. So it is like, if we talk about wiping away history, that statue is wiping away history. It's not a real history. It's replacing real history.
Roberto,
and the community has spoken, by the way. Mm-hmm. The community has spoken, and for James Taylor to strong arm and suggest that, like, hey, I got the criminals who, you know, vandalized this statue, is, you don't really have your pulse on the community that you're supposed to represent. If you are going after our hero, our person who's like, no, F that guy, you know what I mean? Like, that's our hero. That person represents how we feel when we look at the statue. And now the person who represents us in the city council is saying, no, I'm going to go after that guy. I think you better take the temperature of the room.
Why isn't not at all? Why isn't Malcolm X discussed more often with regards to these conversations, particularly at the school level?
Very specifically what I just touched on. Because the contrast between he and MLK was more digestible in the fact that he even quoted Jesus in the Bible, the turn the other cheek kind of thing. And that's what people want. That's what people want from people of color. People want from people of color us to be docile, us to turn the other cheek, us to look away, and us to let them do this stuff that they're doing, specifically murdering people when the police show up.
So, and I think, you know, let's talk about the fact that the systemic racism that we're confronted with today, the establishment that perpetuates it, is the same establishment, right, that contributes to these textbooks, right, to who can be a part of history or who can't be a part of history. What narrative do we want to tell versus the one we don't want to tell? We see it on a daily basis with media, right? Mainstream media don't want to include or uplift certain stories. It's the independent media outlets that are doing it, right? It's the Bill Bartholomew's, the Pat Fords that are lifting up those stories. You know, Gene Valicenti has focused on donuts and the Columbus statue all week. And here's a person that a lot of people want to listen to, right, on WPRO. And there's a problem with that. So I know I'm taking it a little further to contemporary times, or current times, but, you know, ultimately I think that's why Malcolm X isn't a part of you know, much of the history teaching that's happening in school systems, because ultimately he was a black man that was challenging the system, saying that, you know, if the Second Amendment was available to white brothers and sisters, then it should have been available to black brothers and sisters, right? So those were the real controversial points of his time, and I frankly think those are the points that we should be bringing up today as well. Sorry, Roberto.
Can you imagine if we're teaching young youth of color, if we're teaching youth of color by any means necessary? Like, I'm not sure that a system that works for the people that it's designed to work for want to upset the apple cart in that way. And here's an example, right? When we saw the incident that happened at Wendy's in Atlanta this week, what we have is people calling the police on a nonviolent offender, right? And his offense was falling asleep in the car. Yeah, he was probably drunk. There's probably other things, but we have a nonviolent offender, and we have somebody calling the police on a black person who's a nonviolent offender. When right now the world is responding to how police react to that. And what I mean by that is in many cases, in far too many cases, it ends up with the black person, the black man being killed, right? So Wendy's calls the police on him, he gets killed, and we have reactions from the community, right? People who I've never heard speak up on behalf of George Floyd, people who I've never heard speak up on any of the victims over the past century, right? Never hear them speak out on these people. Now, all of a sudden, they're really sad for these people at Wendy's who lost their job because the Wendy's was burnt down. I'm confused because you were supposed to be our ally. You were out there marching with us and you were out there chanting with us. And one of those chants that you were chanting with us was no justice, no peace. Well, guess what, Monkey Fighter? What do you think no justice, no peace means? It means there is not going to be peace until we have justice. In this situation, we saw that there was no justice yet. We saw that another person was killed, and yet you still want peace. You can't have it both ways. And I'm sorry, those people will have another opportunity to get another job. I hope they rebound in life. But you know who's not going to rebound in life? That black man that they called the police on who got killed that night. He's not going to have another chance at life. So maybe let's focus on him instead of a Wendy's fire.
To your point.
I mean, it's
We'll just jump in.
Yeah. So
to your point, Malcolm X is taken by the popular culture, and he's taken by the media, and he's taken by the movie makers, and they emphasize, of course, the ballot or the bullet. But this is the same Malcolm X who said education is the passport to the future, for tomorrow belongs to those who prepare for it today. This is the same Malcolm X who said you can't separate peace from freedom because no one can be at peace unless he has his freedom. The future belongs to those who prepare for it today. If in fact you want a majority community to rise up economically, I can't think of a better, if you will, spokesman for it during the last generation of great racial upheaval than Malcolm X. It's frustrating to me that the mainstream media constantly feels the need to shape, massage the argument and to frame people in a light that makes sense for their narrative. And we don't do enough to fight that misinformation. That's yikes. Just want to throw that out there.
So I mean, I think that it's important for our listeners to take in everything that Roberto has shared today, everything that Bill has shared, and the reflections that Pat has had. But before we kind of leave, I do want to give an opportunity to our guest, and at this point, I would say partly co-host. Right, we're in this together, and in your final take. So we'll go down the line. We'll get everyone's final take. Really what you're taking away from this discussion, and something else, something that outrages you today. Of all of the things that we're confronted with, what is it that's keep you up at night, and what is the first step to addressing that? So if everyone could address those 2 points, your final take, and what is outraging you, and what's our first step to address it, I think that would be a great takeaway for our listeners. So why don't we start with, we'll go the other way around now. We'll start with Pat.
Okay, well, first of all, let me talk about my outrage. And I've alluded to this before, and I don't know that I mentioned it tonight, but of course it's the school systems here in the state. We have lost an entire generation, not because of the efforts of that generation, but we lost an entire generation to, if you will, I won't even call it the mediocrity, the outright failure of our schools to prepare them for greatness. And I will tell you, as the husband of a teacher with over 35 years experience and the father of 2 daughters, I am convinced there is greatness in every child. It's the job, if you will, the self-appointed job, the self-appointed exclusive job of the educational community to find that greatness and cultivate it. And it's not because of a lack of money. We spend a fortune here in both local taxpayer money and federal money in a school system who seems to be use the students as sort of a necessary aggravation to keep around in order to justify an incredible bureaucracy, an incredible failure. And so that is not the fault of those students. And we often heap scorn amongst these young people who seem lost, who seem confused, and sometimes even the ones who, like the leaders of this current movement, aren't lost and aren't confused at all, in fact, know exactly where they're going. So why are we heaping scorn on them when I have seen the enemy and he is us? It is this generation, my generation, that has failed these students because we're more intent on maintaining a status quo and a bureaucracy than actually finding ways to break through and harness and free up their inner greatness. That's a generational outrage for me, and I will probably fight it till the day that I'm not around. In terms of my observation for this week, I just want to amplify one more time that you've got the collective mainstream media, and obviously as an indie media guy, I obsess over this. The tagline of our network here is that we are outrage porn free, civilly disobedient media. Well, ultimately, the notion that they live in this nether world where everything is just, and I'll talk about one host in particular whose obsession with Walt Disney and his perfect little life, it seems to preclude any consideration whatsoever that there is drama, controversy, and pain in the lives of a great deal of the Rhode Island population through no fault of their own, but simply the circumstances that the very institutions that he seems to revere and seems to want to cover for, all right, have perpetrated upon these students and upon these young people. So yeah, I'm pissed. I'm really pissed. And I'm blessed in a sense that, you know, my quote-unquote privilege, if you will, is that I was able to avoid those traps for my children, to which I am eternally grateful for. But damn it, I mean, we're talking about bullshit donuts when another generation is literally at stake as we speak. They should be ashamed of themselves. Thank you.
Thank you, Pat. All right, so let's go with Roberto.
My outrage is our governor. Our governor right now. I think there were some things that I thought were maybe commendable at the very start of the pandemic. The seriousness in which she seemed to take it, I thought was hopeful. And since then, it's really been downhill. I was absolutely grossed out by her turning to the digestible parts of the community leadership and bringing them on stage to support her. And those are people who she's patting on the back, people who are endorsing her mobilizing the military against students, which is disgusting and outrageous in itself, but also people who are on behalf of Black people. This person thanked John DePietro. I was really confused. This is not an ally to the Black Lives Matter movement. Governor Raimondo, and she also came out at the easiest. She picked her moment to come out when there was maybe a couple dozen students left. And maybe she needs to knock it off, because she was out there with no mask and touching other people, you know what I mean, in that moment where she could go and get her photo op. I'm really put off. I should also mention the equity committee that Dr. Munoz and I are participating on with the state. And it's really, they are talking at community leaders. And I don't know how, I'm not going to speak for Dr. Munoz, but I feel like a token on that community. I feel like, hey, here's a Latino name, Gonzalez. We've got Gonzalez working with us, and he's part of this. I haven't been part of any of it. They've just been showing me data and things that I don't really agree with their leadership on. So I've been very frustrated there, and hopefully that improves. I want to also point out something else that's on my mind recently is the confusion that I talked a lot about, the confusion over the Columbus statue, the confusion over are the police our friends, the confusion over what is the difference between defund and abolish the police. I want to abolish the police, but hey, people want to defund, which means, hey, we'll still have police, but we'll also redistribute some of those funds to education and social services. And I can be with that as a consolation prize. The other piece of confusion they have is over Antifa. Like, a lot of people think Antifa is some bad guys that are going to come and get us. Antifa is not. Antifa is a word, and let's break it down. Anti, right, which means I'm against, and the fa is short for fascism, right? Like I'm against fascism, right? Anti-fascism. So where do we stand? Are we pro-fascism? So like, if you're not Antifa, then that means that you're down with fascism, and I'm confused by this whole take on this takedown of Antifa. It's weird to me, but I am hopeful. I watched a special on YouTube this week featuring Dave Chappelle. It was called 846 after the amount of time that knee was on the neck of the murder victim. And what he said that really resonated with me, when Don Lemon called him out at one point and like, hey, we need your voice. We need your voice out there. And he said, no, man, they're doing it. They had enough of my voice. They had enough of my old ass voice. And look at what my generation did. Their generation is bailing us out. Their generation is doing the work right now. And it really made me think, yeah, man, maybe in some of this stuff, we need to just step back and support the work that the young people are doing. So with that said, I want to refer us back to Juneteenth. I want to refer, that's a rally that's happening this Friday from Classical High School all the way to the State House. Maybe we could put some information up on your social media at some point. And that is held by young people. So I would refer you to our young people at Steambox RI, but this event is happening because of young people from DARE. This event is happening because of young people from Arise. This event is happening because of young people from PRISM, an amazing organization, and the Providence Student Union, and more. So if you don't know, now you know. Go and look up these organizations. This is who we need to be supporting, not our Black Lives Matter Rhode Island. There seems to be some confusion around that. I am definitely pro Black Lives Matter in the national movement, but our local organizations that are getting it done, I just named Arise, DARE, Steambox, PRISM, Providence Student Union, Young Voices is another one. There's one more organization. I'll kick myself in the butt later. More, absolutely. And the one on Broad Street, Youth in Action. Thank you. Sorry.
All right, awesome. So thanks for sharing that information as well, Roberto. For our listeners, we'll be posting that on social media and reposting or resharing as we get the information. So please add that to your calendars for now. So Bill, would love to hear your final take and what's outraging you today and how we move forward.
The Columbus statue, the idea that the police are the good guys to take on the bad guys. The idea that what government puts forth is what's correct. And then that notion that if you go against any of this, you're somehow some kind of unpatriotic slob that should be put in the corner, and the boot should be on your chin. That's how I experienced my youth. And to be honest with you, even a person who lived in New York during the height of Occupy Wall Street and really started to understand the modern day version of resistance, somebody who fell asleep with a Noam Chomsky book or whatever, for years, that the connecting of those dots never really fully took place with the millennial generation of which I'm a part of. Alluding to what Roberto said, Gen Z will have none of that. They have blown right past this notion of patriotic versus unpatriotic, nationalistic versus unnationalistic. They couldn't care less about it. It's reflected in the music that they make. It's reflected in the art that's created. It's reflected in the conversations you have on the side of the street outside of AS 220. It's reflected in the conversation of the parking lot that I have in the parking lot here in the building that I'm in, that also share space with Amore and PRISM. And more than anywhere, it's reflected in the youth-led action that's taking place right now at the State House and all around the state, frankly, even in Newport. And there's a Juneteenth rally in Newport as well. Gen Z should be leading the way on all of these conversations. It's time for the gentle approach, the docile approach to be put on the back burner. And frankly, this age group, through their ability to connect with social media, their understanding of digital coin, their understanding of economics and modern monetary theory and the flimsiness or phoniness of federal debt, these are basic things that they understand that at least for me, speaking of my generation of millennials, we still were a little bit trepidatious about. We had 9/11 in the back of our minds, and just the idea that some sort of resistance is going to get you in trouble. Now it's the opposite. Not resisting is going to get you in trouble. You're in the minority. You're on the outside looking in if you are going along with the status quo. And that is the message that Gen Z is sending. And it couldn't have been louder or more clear than it was on Sunday at the State House. My big takeaway, that's my big takeaway. I guess my outrage is, look, first of all, John DePietro, you mentioned him. Here's a guy who yesterday did his Facebook. Look, this is somebody who had a massive media position on the predominant radio station in the state, doing national hits just a few years ago before he talked his way out of it. Now, really a sad and pathetic shadow of himself. Yesterday, broadcasting wearing an ICE baseball cap, okay? Antagonizing children attending rallies in Burnside Park, okay? So my outrage is hyper-specific to one individual, but it extends broadly to these characters that are utilizing their platform to perpetuate myths and frankly evil. But it also extends to the folks, you think about the 10,000 people that turned out at the second major Providence rally here versus the 2,000 last Sunday, okay, just a week later. How many of those folks that were there on Saturday a week ago were there because they wanted an Instagram shot? Were there because they wanted to participate in something the way that, you participate in going to watch your high school basketball team compete for the state championship? Okay? Those folks, if you want to be a part, if you want to be in, you need to be in all the way. Okay? And yes, there's legitimate concerns about COVID. There's legitimate concerns about scheduling and so on and so forth. Look, everybody can't do everything. I get it. But we're starting to really understand who's leading the way. It's becoming more and more clear each and every week. And for those folks that just want to use this moment to elevate themselves and not necessarily elevate society as a whole, my message to them is to get out of the way because, boy, once again, you're going to be in the minority. When the history books are written 100 years from now and they select a photo that's, here's Brooklyn and this, in the summer of 2020, people turning out, here's a Wendy's on fire. And when those photos are taken, do you want to be the person that was on the outside resisting that change? Or do you want to be someone who's actually a part of making that change? And, frankly, I think that there's a lot of people right now who are unsure what that means. Here's your chance to figure it out and get involved in a productive way.
Awesome. Thanks for sharing that, Bill. So here's my take, and I think it really feeds off of what everyone is saying. My take is that youth are leading, but those of us that are no longer within that age range of youth really need to put our backs down and lift the youth up, and we need to lay it on the line. We need to lay our reputations on the line if need be, to really elevate their voices and make sure that the change they want to see is happening. What I'm outraged by are puppets. Tokens. Roberto and I will not be tokens. No one on this broadcast, on this live stream, will be puppeted by this administration or by any other administration. And that's why it's a privilege to be with you all here today, speaking to these issues. I'm outraged by the old guard that won't just get the hell out the way. I am outraged by the new guard, the 20s and 30-year-olds that are putting suits on and selling their souls and trying to be the face of our communities only to get an extra dollar in their pockets. And I am even more outraged at them, right? Because they're jeopardizing the movement more than the old guard. I am outraged by establishments in the Republican and the Democratic Party. I was listening to the Democratic Party committee or state committee yesterday just to try to get a sense of who's on there, who's leading it, what are they talking about? Because they're supposed to represent policies and issues that really reflect what communities need, right? That's at least the lie that they often tell us. And everyone who spoke and everyone who lifted up and endorsed another candidate, none of them from South Prov to Pawtucket to Central Falls were saying anything about the inequities in COVID-19 during the first 3/4 of this crisis. None of them were coming out or are coming out and really speaking to some of the real policy changes that need to happen, whatever spectrum you are, whether it's abolish the police or defund the police, they're just not speaking. And again, these are the 30-year-olds that are going to be running for U.S. Senate. They're the 30-year-olds that are going to be placed into seats as others retire. So I'm outraged by puppets and tokens that are inhibiting our ability to change in Rhode Island. And my dedication, where I stand firmly today is to continue to confront those individuals, to face them head on, to call them out for their cowardice and their conformity. And I think that as we follow youth and push forward, as those individuals get in their way, we as kind of adults in this situation really need to, again, put our bodies in the front of the line to make space for youth to push through. So that's what, we'll end on that note. A need to, again, amplify the voices of communities, of youth, to push forward and to really make sure that we're doing everything possible, which I know the individuals on this call are, and those that stand behind them are as well, to make the world a better place and really to make Rhode Island a better state, a more equitable state, and a just state to live in. So thanks again, gentlemen, for joining me today. I look forward to next week's call on Pump Up the Volume, Tuesdays at 7:30 p.m. And for everyone who's been listening to us, thank you so much. I hope that this was edifying, and we are really doing this for you. So please spread the word, and we look forward to seeing you next week. Thank you.